Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About the Built Environment. I'm your host, Tom Hargreaves, Director at AG Built Environment Consultancy, filling in for Jonathan Shaw, who couldn't make today's podcast recording. Today, we have an insightful discussion lined up for you focused on the Building Safety Act 2022. We'll explore how the Act impacts culture, competency and accountability within the industry. Joining me are two fantastic guests who bring their expertise in architecture and law to the table. First up, we have Charles Shorland, a senior architect and principal designer at Bowker Sadler. Charles has an extensive background in architectural design and is here to share his insights on building safety in light of the recent changes. And secondly, we're joined by Jessica Stanway, an associate at JMW Solicitors LLP. Jessica specialises in legal matters related to construction and property, and she'll be shedding light on the legal aspects of our topic today. Now then, without further ado, let's get into it. So I thought I'd just start by getting a quick sort of background from both of you and your careers to date. Charlie, is that okay with you, Charlie?
Absolutely.
I'm going to start with you. Do you want to give us a brief overview of your career to date?
Yep, I've been an architect for very nearly 50 years. And since retiring from my practice as senior partner with Ansell & Bailey, I've joined Bowker Sadler, who I knew well, and I'm really responsible for the principal designer role, originally CDM. And in the brave new world that we've all entered, I'm now taking on PD building regs as well.
The confusing world as well.
So I am a property litigation lawyer. I have been working in legal practice for about 10 years now. Prior to joining JMW, I spent 6 years with a boutique law firm that focused solely on property management in block buildings. So fire safety and building safety has been a primary focus of mine for about 7 years. And now I sort of act for developers, freehold investors, asset managers, advising on the effects of the Building Safety Act and also advising on potential claims that can be brought under the Act.
Brilliant. So two very different backgrounds for us today and lots to explore. So diving straight into the topic of today, Jessica, do you want to give us a brief overview of the Building Safety Act?
So the Building Safety Act, you can't talk about the Building Safety Act without talking about the Grenfell Tower tragedy, because the Act itself didn't emerge in isolation. So the Grenfell Tower tragedy we know happened, I believe it's 7 years ago now. And that was where a fire which was started by what we believe was a faulty fridge freezer spread through the building very quickly, and that spread of fire was accelerated by combustible cladding, and also there was an air gap which enabled the stack effect, which allowed the fire to sort of shoot up the side of the building, and 72 people lost their lives. And to put that into perspective, that is the greatest loss of human life in a residential fire since World War II.
Wow.
So the political reaction to Grenfell Tower was very quick. The government immediately commissioned an independent report into what happened, and that was led by Dame Judith Hackett. So we know that was the Hackett report. In that report, and it was fairly scathing on the property industry, she found essentially that there was a lack of regulation. There was a lack of concern for safety of residents. There was endemic failures across the industry to ensure the safety of buildings. And there was a lack of enforcement where there were found to be breaches of regulations. This is what brought us to the Building Safety Act. So the government looked to implement the recommendations of Dame Judith Hackett by giving us the Building Safety Act, which effectively is split into 6 parts, although the first part is only an introduction. Parts 2 and 3 intend to overhaul the building regulation regime. So we've now got what we refer to as a new regime for the construction of new buildings, particularly high-rise buildings moving forwards, but it does apply to all buildings. You've then got parts 4, which deal with occupation and management of buildings when they are occupied. Parts 5, which deals with the costs of repairing buildings, and there are other provisions in there. Part 6, which is rather miscellaneous provisions which bring it all together.
So a lot to absorb.
It is.
From an architect's point of view, a lot of emphasis on building regulations and design now. Do you just want to give the listeners a flavour of your understanding of the Building Safety Act?
Well, I don't think we should be overawed by the whole thing. I'm very positive about it because effectively what it's doing is it's making designers and contractors more accountable for what they do. And the famous expression that you'll hear repeated time and time again is, if you like, the golden thread. And this takes the whole process from the inception of a building by a client through to the appointments of the design team and then on to the actual building of it. And at all stages, the sort of managing and monitoring of the process is accountable. And as a PD, which principal designer, I am accountable under the building regs for ensuring that the people who are working on that are competent, and secondly, that they're complying with the regulations. And from that point, when the building goes to the contractor, that he is building to that design without change, or if he does make changes, those have to be reported back to the building control. So the golden thread finally ends up as the health and safety file, and it's a terrific document. We've got a high-risk building underway. The way it's going at the moment, I'm pretty confident that we've got everybody in place, including in the final phase, the accountable person who then has to run the building and the common parts of it once it's in occupation.
So you mentioned competency there. It's been a question in our office that we've been looking at. So who is competent to act as the PD building regulations?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm a sheepdog, aren't I? And am I a good sheepdog? What we've done is we've produced a template. We've asked a series of questions about what the people have actually done, the designers, what stage they reach. Do they mentor? Do they go on with CPD? Do they keep going continuous practical development? And then we also ask them for examples of other jobs with the proviso that we can talk to the clients of previous jobs and see how they performed. There is a PASS 8671, which is very complex, I think, and keep it simple is my motto.
I've read that document several times and I'm none the wiser.
I know, it's hard work. Jessica will explain it better than we can.
No, we lean quite a lot, especially with how new the Building Safety Act is. We find ourselves as lawyers leaning a lot more on professional advisors now in terms of what they think these things mean, because there's such a practical element to the building safety. And unfortunately, it is drafted specifically to allow the industry to sort of take control of it. So you'll find there's a lot of reference to words that litigation lawyers absolutely love. Things like reasonable efforts, proportionate, things like that. And the idea is no building is the same. Every building is completely different, and legislation is very difficult to draft for those circumstances, so you leave it very wide open. And we find that we are constantly in communication with developers and architects, CDM consultants, absolutely everybody, to find out what their take on things is, because we're all sort of navigating it together.
Under the Building Safety Act, when it finally came into law, the position of Building Safety Regulator was taken away from the local authority of building control and from, at the time, independent controls. And really, in conjunction with the HSE, the Building Safety Regulator was founded. Since then, and they deal with the high-risk buildings, all inspectors have to now become the regulatory building control approvers, registered building control approvers.
They've all got classifications, haven't they now?
They've all got classifications, and that has caused a problem in exactly the same way as Jessica was saying. The HSC are short of people, so are all these regulatory approvers. They haven't got enough staff.
Yes, I believe the deadline keeps getting extended at the moment.
Yeah, it was supposed to be April, wasn't it? It's gone to July.
6th of April.
Now
and
it's
they've
gone on.
extended it to July.
Yeah. Well, we've had the 6th of July.
What impact have you seen on the ground, I suppose, from a small SME like ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
How are you adapting? How are Bowker Sadler adapting?
I've got a lot of jobs, both as PD CDM and PD building regs. And the RIBA, which have been a member a long time, are under the opinion that you can do both roles. I know that the APS are on the opinion that they're two different roles, and I do think it's a great shame that the word principal designer has been used in both those roles. It has led, I think, to complication. That said, I actually think that we should talk a bit about the gateways, which I manage under the PD building regs, and we should explain HRB's high-risk buildings and the way in which the gateways work.
Go for it.
Okay.
Tell us about the gateways.
Well, the building we've got on site at the moment, which is 130 apartments, 11 stories, is way above the limits required, which are 7 stories, and only 2 residential apartments. So it covers quite a lot of categories. We were on site before Gateway 1 and 2, but in essence, Gateway 1, when you're going for planning, you can't do that without a fire statement, and you can't do that without a certain amount of information on the stability and safety of the whole building. And at that stage, you're also saying who is the client and who is the PD, and I think also who is the principal contractor. That gets you started, and you can't go any further forward with the HRB until such time as that's been approved. And then Gateway 2 kicks in. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica. And at Gateway 2, we're really talking about full plans application by competent people. And when that's approved, that is what you're going to build. And as I said, we have to track significant changes, which are either notified or major changes.
Yeah, we're just looking at our first Gateway 2 application for a roofing project on a high-rise building, and it's extensive, the information that needs to be provided.
Just for roofing on an existing building.
Yeah.
Well, that's the interesting thing is, it's all these thousands of cladding jobs that are going on around the country, or recladding jobs, plus things like roofing at high level. So we're not just talking about a new build, not by a long shot. We're talking about major refurbs, and even quite small refurbs if it's high enough.
And there's a big time and cost implication with that. So I think the regulator, which we should touch on, they're aiming for a 12-week turnaround. I believe they're operating around about 20 weeks at the moment. So a roofing job that we could have on site fairly quickly at the moment is being pushed, well into the autumn and beyond.
I think this is what I'm sort of hearing from a lot of developers and people that I speak to, is that the costs of these projects is now so front-loaded in a way that it wasn't before. So you've really got to better plan out how you're going to take these projects on, how you're going to fund them from the beginning and things like that. So it's had that sort of impact, just the time cost.
Is it force majeure if you get into that situation?
No, I don't think you could argue that.
Because you now know the legislation.
Yeah, because we're aware of it. And I think even on some of the claims that I'm looking at, because I do a lot more of sort of historic stock and issues with liability there. But even then, we can argue it's a lot of it really is things people should have been doing anyway.
Yeah.
And bringing these things forward. They could potential to argue that contracts are frustrated because there's just no way to comply. But those arguments have yet to make it before a court, so we don't know how much strength there will be in some of these arguments. I'm sure there are plenty of developers and other people affected who will be making those arguments. And they're making lots and lots of other arguments, as human rights arguments coming out in relation to the Building Safety Act and looking at things like that. Because the cost of these works, the cost of remediating unsafe buildings is huge, and it is bankrupting certain companies.
I believe as well, once you obtain your gateway to approval, you start on site, there's a big emphasis on change control as well.
Well, we're working at Stockport. It's a big job there, this 11-storey, and we're working with CADIC, who are superb in the way that they've gone about information control. So we're using Viewpoint. All the drawings are loaded up, all the changes are loaded up. We decide whether it is a major change or a reportable change or a recordable change. We have a lot of talk with the building inspector, you can call him that these days, in this case Ascent, who are being very proactive about it. Now actually we haven't made any changes that would have to come under that category. So all the fire was well thought through, firefighting, all stability, etc. But we've got a form that we can fill in for change control. We should also perhaps mention materials which come into part of the new legislation. So you can't just have a door set and then decide actually you're going to have a door and a door frame. So all of this is sought out well in advance. And I think it's going to stop too much contracted with design. Certainly with the big designs of mechanical and electrical, I think they will come in at an earlier stage, and that's to be welcomed.
But I suppose whilst we can plan construction projects to the nth degree, some change happens. Say the window manufacturer goes into administration, you're dealing with a HRB. I think what we're saying now is we have to go back to gain approval again for a change in window specification on a HRB, which again could have a significant time implication. All big program implications.
Yes, but a good contractor has done a great deal of work to source his window contractor to enable that won't happen and hopefully won't go bust. You've chosen a good one because we all know of window manufacturers who do go bust. But I don't want to tempt fate, but we have got a very good supply chain, and the information that's been loaded that already building control is seeing and everybody else is excellent. And just moving forward, we've also made sure that the client has already named their accountable person, so that when we hand the building over at Gateway 3, which is quite a lengthy procedure, Jessica can talk more about, I'm sure, we have an accountable person who's coming to the building progress meetings on site to familiarise himself or herself as they're going forward, so that there's no surprises.
That's a big role, the accountable person.
It is, and a lot of my clients fall under that role, or at least are carrying out the duties of an accountable person. Just for context, Dame Judith Hackett identified that there was no person that was accountable at the point of occupation. And that goes back to obviously her criticism that there's this indifference to the safety of residents. So her recommendation was that there had to be a clear, identifiable person that would be responsible for safety when a building was occupied, which is how we've got this role of accountable person. For us, it's potentially looking at, I do a lot of advising clients on who the accountable person is, because quite often the way in which we structure buildings and land in this country, it's never clear, because the accountable person is the person with the responsibility for managing the structure of the building. But that may well be subject to how the leases are in place. It may well be multiple people have that responsibility, particularly where, say, you've got a multi-block building with commercial units at the bottom and things like that. You'll have various people that fit into that role. So we do a lot of sort of advising as to who the accountable person is, and then advising on what their duties are, because those duties are really broad. You've got they've got this overarching duty to manage and assess building safety risk at all times. Then on top of that, they've got a lot more sort of administrative responsibility, as you said, information collecting. That's quite a big one, particularly I know for new builds, it's great moving forward so everybody knows what information we need to get, and we can get that at construction stage. If you've got a building that was built in 1995, the majority of those companies involved have gone under. You can't get that information from anywhere. They're effectively trying to go backwards and piece together a puzzle to find the information to satisfy the regulator that this building is safe. And they've also now, not only have they got to focus on sort of fire risk, they've got to focus on structural safety as well. So again, you're bringing in lots of experts, you're bringing in your surveyors to do lots of sort of various reports so you can understand the makeup of your building, so that you can then create a safety strategy for the residents that live in it. And again, all of this is very time consuming, it's very expensive, but it has to be done. Yeah.
I mean, having handed over several buildings over my career, there's always a sort of mad rush at practical completion anyway, gathering information about the building, whether it be as-built, statutory compliance certification. So to get all that in place to then make a Gateway 3 application at the end, that's going to be a considerable amount of program/time implication. Are we at risk of having some buildings stood there empty for a while?
Well, exactly, and I think that's definitely been a concern of a lot of clients of mine, is this gap between, so once you apply for your completion certificate at Gateway 3, the building, as you said, the regulator's got 8 to 12 weeks to bring it back, but they are delayed. People are just not hearing from them, which will just be a resourcing problem. But it is a criminal offence now for the building to be occupied if that completion certificate isn't in place. So, and the accountable person, or the principal accountable person, because that's a more distinct role, they are potentially criminally liable if they allow the building to be occupied. And that liability, the Act, it very much draws from environmental law in this way, but it allows you to go behind the company, because the accountable person will often be a company. It allows you to pursue directors and officers of the company. So there's that individual criminal liability there.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that, because that has been a hot topic in our office. So just taking a step back, so yeah, our understanding is there is both a corporate and potential personal liability under the Act. There's a lot of liability under the Act in different ways, and part of this is born out of Michael Gove standing in Parliament and saying, I'm going to protect leaseholders. So there was a bit of sort of rush drafting for Part 5 to try and make developers more liable, and unfortunately sometimes that is the only way to get regulations to stick and to change the culture, because that is a lot of what the Building Safety Act was trying to do, was change the culture and the attitude towards these buildings. You need that enforcement on the side. So there are particular offences if you've breached certain parts of the Act. So Part 4 is your accountable persons, Part 2 and 3, that's where you're potentially looking at contractors or anybody involved in the construction of a building, or designing a building. They may well commit an offence under the Building Safety Act, and the Act is structured in such a way that effectively you can bring proceedings against individuals, because they recognise that most of the people involved in these in the construction and design will be companies. And you can only you can't imprison a company, and fines may well just be part of the cost of doing business for some people. You had to have that criminal liability to make the culture change stick. Yes.
But let's be positive about it. Let's be upbeat about it.
Absolutely.
And you're quite right. What Judith was trying to do was to instigate a cultural change. And she's done it. Not completely yet. We're all early days. All our documents, all my documents, are live documents. I keep telling the designers, you've got to revisit that document. You've got to look at it again. And a similar thing with the contractors.
It's not a box ticking role,
it's
is it?
Absolutely not a box ticking exercise. And we, in any new job, we've got a lot of housing smaller housing jobs, will produce a drawing which is the constraints, the site constraints. Now, even that will change over time. So there'll be overhead telegraph poles or cables and all the rest of it. That starts to disappear. That needs to be updated. So it's a constant process of updating it. It's expensive, but the alternative, when it's litigation, is hugely more. I want to touch on the behaviour, and that's just back to the culture. And I think we're fortunate that we work as an SME on a pretty wide range of building types, everything really except healthcare. And with only 2 exceptions, and they are hard work at the moment, everybody has bought the message. And even though some of the companies are quite small, they absolutely appreciate that this is what they have to do. And they don't do it grudgingly. They realise how important it is. And they are learning, as we are all learning from it. And going forward, I'm very, very confident about it all. I think it's good.
I'd agree. I think it's been needed for a long time now. And it's interesting because we work with a number of other businesses, engineers, architects, and some are fully embracing these changes, whilst others are still trying to sort of pass liability. So yeah, there's a mixture in the marketplace at the moment, I'd say. Taking a slightly down a different route, so we've got the Building Safety Act. What other industry changes would you like to see? I'm going to come to you first, Jessica.
I would like to see, because part of the purpose of implementing the Act was to free up the lending market, because lenders were so nervous to lend on buildings prior to the Building Safety Act, because they were so unsure of the risk. And part of the elements that the Building Safety Act was brought in was to give them more confidence in lending. I don't think that confidence has come through just yet. I think the market is still a little stagnated, which has an impact on our housing market overall, because flats tend to be starter homes for people, and then they buy those and move on. People aren't buying flats anymore because they can't, and people can't sell flats. They're still stuck in them 7 years on from Grenfell. And I'd like to see sort of the lenders sort of get to grips a little bit more, I think. And I think it is just, we're still a little bit in that uncertain phase. I do think it's been very educational for the past 2 years. People are getting there now, they're understanding it and what's required of them. But I think that just needs to filter through.
Excellent. Charlie, what else would you like to sort of change?
Well, what I'd like to point out is we've talked obviously about high-risk buildings and the Safety Act, the Building Safety Act, but there's a plethora of secondary legislation in place since the 1st of October. I have to read this because it's completely, the building regulations, etc., brackets, amendments, brackets, England, close brackets, regulations 223, and the building brackets, approved inspectors, etc., brackets, regulation 210,
no wonder
brackets,
you needed to write it
as
down.
amended 223. You know, the titles are, it is what they say on the tin, but the tin is horribly long. But effectively, it's the same process as the gateways. They've called it declarations. The terminology is changing. The LABC are calling it supplementary information. A lot of the approved inspectorates have now started to produce their own forms. So the whole system is really very similar to the big high-risk buildings. And I think that's what I'd like to see. And I absolutely think it's coming forward. And I've just written here that don't be afraid by or overawed by all the new legislation. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, but they are good intentions. And the principal duty holders of client, principal designer and principal contractor should talk to each other. Clear communication, absolute must. That's my advice. Read some of the articles, but only the recent ones. Don't worry about the transitional stuff. That's been and gone. And talk to Jessica if you're in trouble. Talk to me if you're not in trouble.
Very sage advice, that.
Well, just define your role as a consultant?
So our role at AG, we're historically sort of project manager, building surveyor, with the CDM principal designer role sort of wrapped in. That's quite a lot of our framework appointments, how they're sort of set up. So yeah, our building surveyors have a background in design, specification, health and safety, and that's drilled into people from day one when they go for their APC, Assessment of Professional Competence. They've got to hit a certain level. So a surveyor, I would like to think, if they've had the right experience, is very well rounded. I say they've been involved with building regulations, applications, but also the principal designer role, thinking about the site abnormals, but also design, how do you access a flat roof? If you can get onto a flat roof, what does the safety regime look like? Is there a handrail? Is there a man safe? Seeing the job through to the end, issuing health and safety files. So I think our role, building surveyor, has always been well placed to sort of deal with the CDM side.
Yes, it's the PD building regs that is the interesting one as we go forward.
Yeah,
and I think one has to be a designer in the wider term for that. Just as we say, we are not clerks of work, we are not health and safety inspectors, but we are, as architects, we are designers in that sense.
Yeah, and the courses that I've sort of sat on over the past 12 months, there's been talk about upskilling. So I think whilst it's expected that the lead designer for building regs will have a working knowledge of all the building regs, which I think God knows, they run like A to Z now these days, don't they? We really need to sort of upskill in terms of Part K, falls, Part B, fire, Part A, structure. I think that's where some of our staff, we've been targeting specific workshops around those parts of the building regs.
But that's we as an office, and I think that's absolutely right. So we do a great deal of CPD, and that's part of what we've got to do for the Association of Project Safety, show the fact that we've actually been on a whole series of courses.
And how long do we think it's going to be before some cases start to come forward?
They're starting to trickle through now. I think, as I said, we had this educational period for a couple of years whilst everyone tried to get to grips with what was going on, because this is a wholesale change for us, especially as litigators. The Act has this retrospective effect, and generally speaking, legislation is only prospective. It only applies from the date it comes in moving forwards, but the Building Safety Act has not done that. It's gone backwards. So you've seen this extension to limitation in the Defective Premises Act. We can go back 30 years now to buildings from the 28th of June 1992. So we can look at and criticise those buildings and bring claims there, and we don't just have to look at the company that built the building, because often developers do set up SPVs and contractors set up SPVs. We can now go after parent companies and associated companies. This is that extension of liability there. And it's figuring out what these things mean, because as lawyers, this isn't normal, this isn't traditional. So there will be fights about it, and there are fights about it at the moment. I believe is it the Wilmot and Dixon case at the moment? Jefford J has just made a ruling on a building liability order, so that's the ability to bring in an associated company. And she had said that she expects them to be parties to the main litigation. So if you are a company that has built a building and there is a dispute over it, and they bring in another company of yours, you've now got double the time and cost of that litigation. So those are things to think about, particularly at drafting stage when you're doing your original contracts and projects. You need to be thinking about your company structure, and these are things that people have never had to really think about before, but it's worth a lot of money, so people will be fighting over it.
Lots to think about. So what practical advice should we be giving our clients under this new piece of legislation? We'll start with you, Charlie. What sort of new advice would you give? What should clients be looking out for?
Seek advice, read about it, but don't get completely immersed in the fine print. Let Jessica and her colleagues do that pretty well for you, but appoint professional people as quickly as possible, including, I think, mechanical, electrical, don't rely on the builder to do that at a later stage. And really be aware of the fact, be open. Communication in all the jobs that I've got at the moment, they're not really going wrong, but where they are, it's down to communication more than the physical side of things. And I think everybody's got to have that clarity of purpose, and don't try and value engineer at the nth day, which is, I hope, it won't die, but I hope that people will realise that it's a very cost ineffective way forward.
And check that competency and keep that on file.
Absolutely. Check everything and keep it all on file. The golden thread.
Jessica?
Agree with Charlie. Engage at an early stage. Be more prepared than you've ever been before. Get that advice early on. Protect yourself at the beginning. Seek advice from. There are so many people who are learning about this and willing to sort of impart knowledge. Speak with them. Get everybody involved at an early stage. And one thing I would say: record everything. Everything you do, every decision you make. Just remember why you made it. If you are called upon in the future to justify yourself in front of the regulator, it's easy when you've got the records there, and it's part of your golden thread in any event.
Great advice. And if you had your time again and you hadn't chosen law, what route would you have gone down?
Oh, I'd just stay far away from buildings, I think. I think I've just had a nice 9-to-5 job.
Perhaps when I was 5, I wanted to be an engine driver.
Wow. I think I would have gone down a trade route myself, given this day and age, sort of flexibility, not working in an office, a skill set that you can use at home. And obviously tradesmen, unreliable these days, charge a fortune. Just think of all the things that you could have done yourself.
But you have something at the end.
And you have something at the end.
I have to say that is very true. I can point to buildings that I'm very proud of.
Thanks for joining us today. I think we could sit here all day chatting, but unfortunately we've got to stick to our timings. But hopefully, whether you're an architect, a developer, a building owner, or simply someone interested in the built environment, you have found today's discussion useful. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, share it with your colleagues and friends. Thank you.